Even her detractors admit that the charitable work of the Catholic Church has been extraordinary. But today we're going to see that Catholic charity has historically been even greater than Catholics themselves may realize. So join me today for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about Catholic charity. Now we all think we know all about Catholic charity, and indeed we do know a great deal about it. Even her opponents admit that the Catholic Church has done more charitable work than you can possibly believe. But Catholic charity is in fact even greater than people realize. And today we're going to explore why. For instance, it's the quality of the charity as well as the quantity. It's not simply that the Catholic Church did a lot of good work for people. That we'll look at in a moment. But it's the spirit that animated that charity as well. So, for instance, the Catholic Church taught that you should help somebody not because you expect a reward or you're going to keep hectoring this person forever, that you owe me something, remember I helped you 3.5 years ago, or you don't do it so that you can show the world what a great person you are. You do it because it pleases God, because you respect a fellow human being as being made in the image and likeness of God, and that you know that charitable work pleases Him. This is why you do it. You do it out of a love for God and your fellow man, not because you expect any kind of reciprocity. Beyond that, we have even the counsel from the Church that you should even help your own enemies. What, are you crazy? In the ancient world, they would have thought that was crazy. In ancient Greece and Rome, that would have been considered absurd. And indeed, in the ancient world, a lot of the giving was self-interested. It was not given out of the pure desire simply to help a fellow human being. So the quality, the kind of charitable work, the spirit that animated it, was very different in the Catholic world than it had been in the world that preceded the Church. But we should not at the same time disparage the question of quantity, because here too the Church excelled. Because for the first time you had institutionalized care for the sick and widows and orphans and the poor. Now again, there had been generosity shown in the ancient world, no one would deny that, but nowhere near the level that we see under the Catholic Church. Now remember my rule, I want to cite anti-Catholics whenever I can to show that what I'm saying really is true, because even an opponent of the Church admits it. Well, I'm fond of citing a historian from the 19th century named W.E.H. Lecky, because he was known to be an opponent of the Catholic Church, and yet when he wrote about this subject and he spanned the historical record, he concluded that there is no question that neither in practice nor in theory, neither in the institutions that were founded, nor in the place that was assigned to it in the scale of duties, did charity in antiquity occupy a position at all comparable to that which it has obtained by Christianity. So it's both the quality and the quantity of the Catholic charitable work that distinguishes it and makes it so historically interesting and compelling. Now, one objection can be raised to what I've said so far. There was an ancient school of philosophical thought called Stoicism. And the Stoics did indeed seem to be people who called for doing good deeds out of a sense of duty and without any expectation of reciprocity. The Stoics, in effect, believed that the wise man was a man who had no emotional connection to the world, who was such a master of his own person that he was utterly unperturbed by outside events, no matter how tragic. Well, it was in that spirit, that very, in a sense, empty kind of spirit of merely discharging your duty, that the Stoics engaged in charitable work. Yes, they taught that the wise man knows that he is a citizen of the world and all men are, in effect, to be cared for, but they are to be cared for without lending any emotional attachment to the relationship. So, for example, Seneca, who was a Stoic, said, "The sage will console those who weep, but without weeping with them. He will succor the shipwrecked, give hospitality to the proscribed, and alms to the poor, restore the son to the mother's tears, save the captive from the arena, and even bury the criminal. But in all, his mind and his countenance will be alike untroubled. He will feel no pity. He will do good, for he is born to assist his fellows, to labor for the welfare of mankind, and to offer each one his part. His countenance and his soul will betray no emotion as he looks upon the withered legs, the tattered rags, the bent and emaciated frame of the beggar. But he will help those who are worthy, and like the gods, his leaning will be toward the wretched. But it is only diseased eyes that grow moist in beholding tears in other eyes." Well, that was the spirit of the charity of the Stoics. So they themselves were to be unperturbed by outside events, by the misfortunes of those whom they helped. And so naturally they were perhaps not as eager to go out looking for evil, because they in effect tried to ignore the existence of evil. They did not make the kind of emotional connection that we see, for example, in a Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, these people were not. In fact, we have example after example of Stoics being given bad news. For instance, "Sir, your child has just perished," and we hear the Stoic reply so flippantly, saying things like, "Well, had to go sometime." Who on earth would say that when losing a child? But that was how the Stoic demonstrated his complete mastery of the outside world. "I'm unperturbed by this. Nothing can affect me. I do not let my emotions get the better of me." Now, getting back to the Catholic Church, where does this spirit of Catholic charity come from? Well, it comes from her founder. It comes from the teaching of Christ himself, who of course said to us, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." St. Paul went to an even greater extreme to some people when he specifically noted that you should show charity even toward your enemies. Now, Christ instructed that of us as well. But St. Paul was cited repeatedly on this front, and his letters were cited repeatedly by early church fathers to encourage people to follow the counsel of St. Paul, and in fact to do good even for their enemies. Now, we're going to talk more about Catholics doing good for their enemies a little bit later. But for right now, let's look at early church history and see them taking the words of Christ and making them into reality. We already see that in early church history, during the context of the Mass, the faithful's offerings for the poor would be placed on the altar. Early Christians also imposed fasts on themselves so that they could save the money they would otherwise use to buy food and give that to those who were in need. Now, the church fathers even, who, as I said in a previous episode, were prolific writers, and that St. Isidore of Seville once said that if you tell me that you've read everything St. Augustine wrote, you're obviously a liar. Yet they found time to do this, because this is an indispensable part of the Christian life. St. Augustine, for instance, established a hospice for pilgrims, ransomed slaves, and gave away clothing to the poor. In fact, he told people, "Don't give me expensive clothing as a gift. You may like me, you may be impressed with my writing and my speaking, but don't give me expensive clothes, because I'm not going to wear them. I'm just going to sell them and give the proceeds to the poor." St. Cyprian and St. Ephrem organized relief efforts during times of plague and famine. Now, St. Cyprian in particular instructed Christians, this is the 3rd century, during a pestilence in Carthage. He said, "If we only do good to those who do good to us, what do we more than the heathens and publicans? If we are the children of God, who makes his sun to shine upon good and bad, and sends rain on the just and the unjust, let us prove it by our acts, by blessing those who curse us, and doing good to those who persecute us." Now, there was a fellow named Pachomius in the Roman army in the early 4th century who was very impressed that at a time when famine and disease struck the army, who came out and helped them? Who came out and lent their undiscriminating assistance? It was those who believed in Christ. And here they were helping some of the very people who had persecuted them in the past. This amazed Pachomius. He wondered, what kind of religious tradition could it be that could inspire this kind of disinterested benevolence, in which you would indiscriminately do good, even to those who had done evil to you? He couldn't believe these people. So what do you think happened? He began investigating the faith. What is this all about? And before long, he himself was a convert. This is, in large part, how a great many Catholics have converted non-Catholics. It's not always by debating them into the church or bashing them over the head into the church, although, by the way, that's how I came in. People bashed me over the head over and over and said, "It's the one true church. What's the matter with you, you Lutheran?" And it made me think, and I came in. But other people have been brought into the church because Catholics have just niced them to death. They're just so nice to them all the time, they just can't take it anymore. Okay, I will look into this. How can you people be so good to me? And that's what brings them in. That's what brought in Pachomius. This is the great witness of Catholic charity. Now, as I say, it's always fun to see what anti-Catholics have to say. And there are many of them. But even anti-Catholics have admitted, as we'll see after the break, famous anti-Catholics have admitted that they don't know how to account for what the Catholic Church has done. They look at Mother Teresa, they don't know how to explain this without using a supernatural explanation. Well, let's go ahead and come on back after the break, and we're going to see some of the Church's most outspoken opponents and what they've had to say about Catholic charity. So come right back. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about the extraordinary story of Catholic charity and arguing that in fact it's been far greater than even the Church's greatest friends, I think, have sometimes appreciated. So we've gone through and seen, for example, what the early Church Fathers did in terms of charity. I gave a few examples of that. Or we've seen in the Scriptures where Catholics are urged to display an exemplary degree of charity. We've seen how it contrasts with the attitude of the ancient world, in which charitable work was something to be done, in effect, for a reward, or to call attention to oneself. And even when you do have the example of a school of thought like the Stoics, that does seem to say you should do good without expecting a reward, they do it out of such an emotionless sense of duty that we almost would view it as dehumanizing today. And that's not what the Catholic Church calls for at all. Well, just before the break, I was pointing out that a great many of the Church's best-known opponents over the years have conceded this point about Catholic charity. So I'd like to make good on that promise and go through a few of them, because this is quite astonishing, what we hear. Voltaire was perhaps the most anti-Catholic French intellectual of the 18th century, and that is saying something. And yet even Voltaire had to admit that he could not get over the extraordinary sacrifice that women religious made in order to work in hospitals. These nuns in their good work were extraordinary to him. And so Voltaire actually said, "Perhaps there is nothing greater on earth than the sacrifice of youth and beauty, often of high birth, made by the gentle sex in order to work in hospitals for the relief of human misery, the sight of which is so revolting to our delicacy." And he said, "Peoples separated from the Roman religion have imitated only imperfectly so generous a charity." Well, of course, ours is the Roman religion that he names. Now that is quite extraordinary, isn't it? That even Voltaire, who despised Catholicism, had to say, I have to hand it to them, I don't know how to account for this. Another example I sometimes cite is Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate was a 4th century Roman emperor from about the 360s. And Julian was anti-Christian through and through. He despised the toleration that had been extended to Christianity in the Edict of Milan in 313 by the Emperor Constantine. And in fact, Julian wanted to bring back ancient paganism and wipe out the Christian presence. And so, what did he try to do? He tried to revive a pagan priesthood and pagan ceremonies and all the trappings of an ancient pagan religion and give that the support of the state. And one thing Julian kept coming back to was that people kept being attracted to the Christian religion because the priests in that religion were so good and kind and generous, and the faithful in that religion were so good and kind and generous. And it drives Julian crazy. He says repeatedly, these people are so nice, why are my pagan priests not that nice? Why are you pagans not so nice? Because the Christians are coming in and they're snatching up people left and right by their good example. Why can't we come anywhere near imitating them? Well, there's an interesting compliment, isn't it? Okay, I mean, Julian has no particular interest in complimenting people who have the faith, and yet here he is forced to do it because you're showing us up as pagans. Now, my personal favorite in this list is Martin Luther, because I myself am a former Lutheran. That is a whole other story for a whole other program. However, I know a little something about Luther. I've read an awful lot of what Luther wrote. And Luther himself admitted that he couldn't quite get a handle on Catholic charity either. And why it was that charitable work under his teaching seemed to dry up. He had no explanation for this, and it drove him crazy. Now, before I go any further, I want to anticipate an objection here, because sometimes I get this. I get people saying, well, should you really portray Martin Luther as an enemy of the Catholic faith? I mean, wasn't he, toward the end of his life, didn't I hear something about maybe he was having second thoughts? Well, I don't think so. Because in fact, the last book Martin Luther wrote was called Against the Papacy at Rome, an Institution of the Devil. So if he's having second thoughts, he has a very funny way of showing it. Well, Luther, of course, taught the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And he repeatedly said that we don't need to do good works in order to get into heaven. Now, this is a very technical, theological discussion here. And Luther, by the way, was not saying that nobody should do good works. In fact, Luther argued that a Lutheran could do good works in an even purer spirit than a Catholic could, because a Lutheran would know that the good works were not going to do anything for him salvation-wise. He was doing them only because he loved God. Whereas a Catholic is always thinking in terms of self-interest when he does good works. But Luther's point was that good works aren't going to do anything in terms of your salvation, whether they're done in the state of grace or whatever, not going to do anything. But what some people took Luther to mean, and Luther is partly to blame for this, was that you don't need to do good works, period. Because Luther would speak in such exaggerated language that at one point he actually said, you can commit adultery 100 times a day, and you can commit 100 murders a day, but as long as you have adultery 100 times a day, and you can commit 100 murders a day, but as long as you have a lively faith, this will not tear you away from Christ. Well, I think people can be forgiven if they conclude from that that good works are not that important. So what Luther started to see in his day was this phenomenon, whereby a tradition of good works began to dry up completely. In fact, Luther himself deeply regretted this and said, at least under the papacy, that is to say, at least under the Catholic Church, you didn't have to force people to be charitable. You didn't have to hold a gun to their heads. They would be charitable spontaneously. He says, whereas living under the gospel, and by under the gospel he means under Lutheranism, he says, not only do I see no charity, to the contrary, people are grasping at each other's belongings. People have become envious and self-centered. He was very interested in this. And throughout his life, he continued to observe good works by Catholics in hospitals and so forth. And it really was a rebuke to him. In fact, at one point, he got so frustrated with his fellow Germans that he tried to leave altogether. He just said, I just had it with you people. Nobody's living the gospel. Nobody's living the Christian life. That's interesting. He had to concede. The Catholic Church had helped to make people charitable. Now, a couple years ago, I was interviewed in the Washington Post. So obviously somebody was fired over that. But I was interviewed in the Washington Post in their live online segment, which I really like, because it's a live question and answer session on the internet. And so readers can type in questions, and then I'm sitting at my computer and I'm seeing all the questions come in, and then I answer them. Well, the questions are coming in fast and furious, so if you didn't have carpal tunnel syndrome before this process, you definitely have it afterward. One of the questions I got I thought was very interesting, and I thought a fair question. The person asked, after all, however, isn't Catholic charity really at its root self-interested? Because, in fact, isn't the person engaged in charity because he expects a reward? He expects to go to heaven. So can't we really say that really Catholic people are no different from people in the ancient world? They're all seeking rewards. And so I thought that was a fair enough objection. So I gave this answer. And I hope this is a good enough answer. If you don't think it's a good enough answer, write to me and I'll give a better answer the next time. But I gave an answer that was twofold. I said, first of all, the Catholic Church recommends to us in effect tells us there are three different levels of sanctity when it comes to doing good. Some people do good simply because they're afraid of going to hell, and that's the only motivation that will reach those people. Now, that's considered to be sort of good enough, but it's certainly not the ideal. At the next level, people do good because, as the questioner suggests, they seek heaven. And now, I personally see nothing wrong with that. But even that is not the ultimate level that the Church recommends to us. The Church says there is a top level. There's a level at which people do good solely because they love God and they want to please God. And that's why they're doing their good works. Not for any expectation or hope of reward, but because they want to please the God they love. And I said to the questioner, this is what the Church is calling us to, is precisely this level of benevolence at which we're not thinking about ourselves. We're thinking only about God and only about doing good for its own sake. But then secondly, I said, consider Mother Teresa's missionaries of charity, because they're such an excellent example. I said, consider them. Now you may say, they're doing all these good works and helping all these people who are in wretched conditions oftentimes, and the sickest of the sick and the poorest of the poor, and they're helping those people simply because they want to go to heaven. But they could go to heaven by working in an air-conditioned office. So what makes them want to work in Calcutta, places of that sort, or makes them want to work in AIDS hospices? I said, they can get to heaven doing those more comfortable things. They can be in an air-conditioned office. Why do they seek this out, then? If all they care about is going to heaven, they could do something else. And moreover, look into their eyes. Look into the eyes of one of those missionaries of charity nuns in one of these AIDS hospices, in which she's looking at patients who oftentimes during their lives have been alienated from the Church, and sometimes even hostile. And when they look up from their beds at these women religious, all they see are eyes filled with love. And I said, can you really look in those eyes and say that all you see is a woman seeking a reward? That's all you see? Don't you see something there that is far deeper and more significant and more moving? That was my answer. And I think that is ultimately the answer. And in fact, the Christian God, following from the Hebrew tradition, believes that it is good for human beings to be good to each other. And this was something new among the religions of the ancient Near East. The gods of ancient Sumer didn't seem to care about the human race at all, or what they did. The gods of ancient Greece sometimes used human beings as playthings. They treated them arbitrarily. They were capricious toward human beings. They didn't seem to care how people behaved toward each other. If you wanted to satisfy some of those gods that I've mentioned, you could do so only through various kinds of ritual sacrifice and then just hope for the best. But our God is pleased not only by the sacrifice of the Mass, but is also pleased by good behavior. He cares about how we treat each other. This was something new under the sun. He doesn't want only ceremony, as important as that is, but he cares that we should be good. We should be good to each other, and that's one of the things that pleases him. And it should not come as a surprise that a God who teaches this is going to give a brand new morality to his people. So next time we're going to see how Western standards of morality have been shaped by the Church. So join me for the Catholic Church, builder of civilization, and I'll see you then.